David Pledger. Can you introduce David?
So David Pledger, we're really excited to have David in today. So David is a contemporary artist working with and between the performing, visual and media arts in Australia, Asia and Europe. So David regularly comments on matters of artistic practice, cultural policy and arts activism, as well as the artist's relationship to society. So we're really excited to hear what David has to say. So we're going to cross live now to David.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, good evening. My name's David Pledger and I'm the very recently appointed Minister for Artists. I'd like to read from a prepared statement, if I might. As of this morning, dated Thursday, May 28, 2020, the federal government has instituted a series of significant changes to its arts and cultural policy. The following changes will be made and, where appropriate, changes to the relevant legislation will take effect immediately. The Australia Council for Arts Organisations will be renamed the Australia Council for Artists. The distribution of agency funds that has hitherto privileged major organisations over smaller organisations and independent practising professional artists will be inverted. The arts industry will be newly described as the artists industry or the industry of artists. I don't think we can legislate that one. No? TBC, we're going to do TBC on that one. The Social Security Transition Act will be amended to provide a new assignation for artists that provide an exemption to reporting requirements which will relieve them of the burden of proof of job seeking outside their profession. Board positions on all arts and cultural institutions and arts companies will be spilt. 75% of these vacant positions will be made available to artists. Artistic directorships and directorates, that is CEO positions of all arts and cultural institutions and arts companies, will be filled by practising professional artists, thus providing working life pathways for those with a skill set, that is artists. These changes will come into effect immediately where appropriate or in transitional stages where necessary. The Prime Minister himself has instigated these changes after experiencing a road to Damascus moment. In tongues this morning, the PM said, and this is a translation, our economic recovery will be highly creative. Our new economy will be artist-led. All media inquiries should be directed to the PM's Chief of Staff. So taking up my ministerial hat, I'd like to acknowledge the lands of future First Nations peoples on which I have worked and lived, and those of the Kulin Nations on which I currently live and work. I'd like to say that the miracle that has been outlined by the media release is probably the only government intervention that can save Australian artists from the servitude that they've been subjected to for some years. That or the UBI, at least the discourse surrounding the UBI. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'd like to tell you a story. It's a short story of the material conditions in which Australian artists lived before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. From 1990 to 2010, direct funding for individual artists in Australia fell by 1/3. So that's over a 20-year period. Now, a significant part of direct funding for individual artists is funneled through Australia's national arts agency, the Australia Council for the Arts. So statistics relevant to the agency are a pretty good indicator. The agency's own research tracks reductions in artist populations and the ever-increasing precarity of the artist's life. These conditions are often linked to the material conditions of Australia's small to medium arts sector. Over the last 5 years, the number of small to medium arts organisations funded by the National Arts Agency decreased by 34%. As such, the small to medium sector has disappeared. There is now only a small sector. Conversely, the major performing arts organisations have increased by 8% in the last 2 years. According to the agency's most recent annual report, 75% of its funding goes to organisations, 59% of which is protected for major organisations and 16% of which is competitive for the small sector. The remaining 25% is split across council initiatives like audience development, professional development programs, marketing webinars, international engagement, and projects to support independent arts practice. As of March 2020, when the $5 million Resilience Fund was announced, support for independent arts practice constituted a rather strange fraction, 1/37 of the Australia Council's total budget of $185 million to be made available to the nation's 50,000 plus practicing professional artists. It's not very much, is it? So the COVID pandemic hasn't really caused any of this. It's simply brought into sharp relief the working reality of the Australian artist, a consequence of the interweaving of colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy into the fabric of mainstream political and economic culture, and ultimately the public sector and civil society. It's the holy trinity of neoliberal power that divides, disturbs, and alienates, and has an abiding disdain for the plurality of ideas, feelings, and senses that generate and receive the arts. In this paternalistic system, artists will always be fetishised, patronised, and financially discriminated against. When bailouts are proposed, artists will be last in line. Institutions always will be privileged above the individual's artist's needs in this system. It's built on a value set in which the artist is expendable. It's a consequence of erasing social value in the process of reducing all activity to the financial. It's just how the system works. And the arts sector is hardwired now to behave in this way. Artists have shifted their language from sustainability to survival to extinction. What happens on a micro level in the arts sector is a distillation of what happens on a micro level in our society. The values and behaviours of one are the values and behaviours of the other. They feed into each other. Hence the extrusion of casual workers, including artists and arts workers, from the job seeker payment. Which brings us to an alternative to the aforementioned miracle. So for the last 7 years, I've made an argument for a living wage for artists. My advocacy is the result of a process of analysis that concluded with the opinion that the arts sector, for the reasons I've outlined, will not undertake its own process of redistribution of existing and future funds that would balance work with fairness, equity, and productivity. And that would act as an example in its representations to government. So I want to be clear. My idea didn't arise out of any expertise specific to the discourse of the UBI. Shorthand, I'm not an expert, like the previous speakers. But as I've interrogated the merits of a living wage for artists, I've been drawn to thinking of what a UBI might mean for artists. And I've made some observations that might be useful in this forum. Firstly, the UBI has lots of aliases. The Universal Resilience Dividend, the Universal Social Dividend, the Universal Wellbeing Payment, the living wage, a livable income, emergency basic income. There's loads more. There's a really interesting proposition that's circulating around in these circles in Australia, led by Marianne Cosgrove, called Just Now, that creates a narrative with plot lines that include jobs creation, universal social dividend, and tax reform. There's also an argument that Australia's already had a very singular experience of the UBI when the Rudd government dropped $900 into our bank accounts to save us from the global financial crisis. There's a lot of contest in this space. But it seems to me that any national scheme needs to be customised to factors specific to each society, such as culture, geography, the kind of economy, and pressing needs of the environment. This whole of society approach makes the UBI a meaningful proposition for addressing the financial discrimination that characterises our arts sector, because it can include all of us. And there's a moral dimension to this discussion as well. Guy Standing, one of UBI's leading global advocates, wrote a book called The New Precariat, of which he spoke last week in a webinar organised by the Green Institute. He said that a member of the precariat, it's a quote, is a supplicant. You have to ask for favours from a parent, a bureaucrat, an employer. And to me, this describes the servile position of the Australian artist, always looking up to the financial tables at which we're not allowed to sit, always waiting for the crumbs to fall. It's not very dignified, is it? A UBI would take the prick out of our collective neck and restore some dignity to our work and our daily life. Another aspect is equity. A UBI acknowledges the worth of all citizens and enshrines basic rights of justice, freedom, and security. It can relieve the burden of our ancestral or family history and so help mitigate the rise of class, which is a fundamental driver of social and cultural inequity in Australia. And for artists, well, we could come in from the cold fringes of society into the warmer climes of the mainstream which becomes more inclusive than what it is now. And a third point is that a level of financial security provided by UBI would allow us to escape the so-called arts industry, which for artists is a mirage. It's an entirely problematic construction that is driven by a comparatively well-paid managerialist class that fetishizes the artist and cannibalizes their need to create. The growth of this class is directly linked to the colonization of the artist. The question I've asked many times over the last years is, how do you characterize a human activity as an industry when a third of its primary producers, artists, live below the poverty line? So there are both contextual and actual issues at play here. In actual terms, a UBI will most likely drag the Australian artist out from under the poverty line. And in contextual terms, the oppressive ambience of the arts sector would be mitigated simply by an external correction of the gross inequity that prevents the arts sector from operating fairly and productively. I'd like to close with this reflection, and it speaks to some of the questions that have popped up. A few years ago, I was invited to write in a publication on the dramaturgy of the universal basic income. And in it, I described how, as a younger artist, I'd been on unemployment benefits for about 8 years. And I was heading overseas to take up a position at the Korean National University of Arts. And I decided then and there that I would not apply for benefits on my return. More than 20 years on, I've established an international and national arts practice. And as the head of a small arts company, I've employed hundreds of artists and arts workers. I remember at the time thinking that that social security context had inadvertently given me a living wage. It was never a disincentive to work, just a useful base from which I could create with and for others. Thank you.
Clocking on, knuckling down and nicking off. Stop on the side, stop, week in, week out, it's chock-a-block. Up like a shot out of the cot, get that